History is riddled with unsolved mysteries and strange cases that even historians are unable to solve. These include out-of-place artifacts, strange paranormal events, mysterious disappearances, and unexplainable true crime cases that have left experts baffled for decades, and in some cases, centuries. The unsolved historical mystery of the Victoria Peak treasure started in November of 1937 when Milton Ernest Noss, known as Doc, was on a deer hunt with 4 men in the Hembrio Basin in New Mexico. The 5 men left their wives at their camp and set out, but while Doc was hunting by himself around the base of Victoria Peak, it started raining heavily and he found shelter under an overhanging rock. Here he noticed a rock that was smoother than the rest, and when he dug it out of the ground, he realized that he had unearthed a mine shaft. Upon his return to camp, he told his wife, Ova, about the find, and they decided to keep it to themselves so that they could explore it on their own later. A few days later, they returned to the site and Doc was lowered down with a rope. When he reached the bottom of the shaft, he was amazed to find drawings that had been painted and chiseled into the rock. But more surprisingly, he stumbled upon a treasure hoard containing gold coins, gold bars, jewels, saddles, and other priceless artifacts. The couple spent much of their time retrieving as much of the treasure as they could, setting up a tent at the base of the mountain. But Doc became paranoid that it would be stolen, and he started burying their finds in different locations across the desert. In 1948, Doc met a man named Charles Ryan who promised him $25,000 in exchange for some of the gold bars that he had found. Doc planned to use the money to expand the mine shaft, but following an argument between the 2 men, Ryan ended Doc's life with a firearm. In the following years, Ova would attempt to claim the treasure that had been left behind, but she was denied by the military, who blasted the shaft closed in 1952. Adding to the mystery is the fact that no one knows how the treasure got there. Some people believe that it belonged to Don Juan de Onate, the founder of New Mexico. Others believe that it's the missing treasure of Emperor Maximilian, who served as Emperor of Mexico in the 1860s. There is also the theory that it was buried there by Chief Victorio of the Chiricahua tribe, but this remains mere speculation, and its true origins remain unknown. In 1774, a man named Jack Parsons was walking along the recently flooded Cheat River in West Virginia when he noticed bones jutting out of the ground. When he pulled one out of the ground, he found it to be a femur bone, and when he compared it to his own, he found that it was 7 inches longer. When the rest of the remains were unearthed and laid out, it was found that the person they belonged to had been approximately 8 feet tall, and an unexplained mystery that baffles experts to this day was born. In 1838, amateur archaeologists were digging at the Grave Creek Mound in what is now Moundsville, West Virginia, when they found 2 sets of remains, both measuring at least 8 feet in height. Then in the 1850s, a cellar of a house was being dug when workers uncovered a further 2 sets of remains, each of which measured taller than 7 feet. The remains were seen by multiple witnesses, but that night they were stolen and presumably sold as relics. 7 years later, workers were subsoiling the vineyards belonging to Sheriff Wickham in East Wheeling when they found another set of bones. Once again, it was measured, and this time it was found to be more than 9 feet tall, and they were put on display at the sheriff's office. 3 more of these inexplicable finds were uncovered in 1875 in Reevesville's Pawpaw Creek. Another was found by archaeologist F.M. Fetty and his wife at White Day Creek in Marion County, and another in 1883 by James A. Faulkner in the same area. The origin of these giants has never been established, and many modern scholars dismiss the finds as having been measured incorrectly, or that they were mistakenly identified due to a lack of knowledge. But due to there being too many witnesses at some of the discoveries, many people believe that the giants really did exist at some point in history in West Virginia. In April of 1930, Joseph Force Crater was appointed as Supreme Court judge by the then governor Franklin D. Roosevelt. But just a few months later, he would become a part of weird history. On the 3rd of August of that year, Crater arrived back in New York following a vacation trip to Maine with his wife Stella. He had left without Stella, but promised to return a week later. This came after he had received a strange phone call, and he told Stella that he needed to go back to New York to sort those fellows out. On the 6th of August, he booked a ticket to a Broadway comedy entitled Dancing Partner, and had dinner with his mistress, a showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz, and William Klein, a lawyer friend of his. Following their meal, Klein and Ritz watched as he walked down the street, presumably to attend the play, but he was never seen again. Crater's law clerk later reported that the judge had destroyed several documents that morning, moved various portfolios to his apartment on 5th Avenue, and had $5,000 withdrawn from his bank account. When news of his mysterious disappearance became public knowledge on the 3rd of September, a frantic search was undertaken, but to no avail. It was, however, found that his safety deposit box had been emptied, and 2 briefcases were missing from his apartment. When the ensuing investigation uncovered his mysterious behavior on the day of his disappearance, rumors started to emerge that Crater had left the country with a mistress, or that his life had been ended. His sudden disappearance briefly spawned the phrase "pulling a crater," used to describe someone who had gone AWOL. No further clues were ever uncovered in the strange case, and Crater was never found. He was declared legally deceased in 1939 at his wife's request. However, in 2005, new evidence was uncovered when a handwritten note was found among the possessions of a woman who passed away earlier that year. It stated that her husband, along with a few other men, had ended Crater's life and buried him under the Coney Island boardwalk. The boardwalk had, however, been excavated in the 1950s as the New York Aquarium was being built, and to this day, it remains unknown whether it really was Crater's final resting place. On the 10th of October, 1880, William Johnston, a farm worker from Fabergé in New South Wales, Australia, was riding his horse at the Mutton Fish Point when he noticed something strange on the nearby rocks. Upon closer inspection, he found that it was a green fishing boat that had its mast and sail lashed, but he saw no sign of its owner. He noticed that there were no tracks leading from the boat, and he made a note of the time, 4:20 p.m. He rode to the farm owned by Albert Reed, and the 2 men returned to the boat, fearing that someone may be hurt nearby or possibly drowned. When they inspected the boat more closely, they realized that it had been purposefully damaged. They also found that a pile of rocks had been dumped into the stern along with blankets, pillows, clothing, and a geology book containing the owner's name, Lamont Young. Young was a geological surveyor for the New South Wales Department of Mines, who had been tasked with surveying of the newly discovered gold fields in Fabergé. He was joined by Maximilian Schneider, a field assistant from Germany, and on the 8th of October, they had arrived at the site. After having lunch with Senior Constable John Barry, who was in charge of the camp, Schneider excused himself, saying that he was going back to his tent. He was, however, never seen again. Young had accepted an invitation from Barry to go fishing the next day, and he was seen near a local lagoon while walking back to his camp, and again by another witness shortly after. But that was the last sighting of him, and he also mysteriously disappeared. The only clues that were found were the items inside the boat. Barry made a list of the items: a pocket compass, a few sacks of potatoes, as well as a pipe and coat that belonged to Schneider. Police discovered that the boat belonged to Thomas Towers, who had set sail 62 miles away from Bateman's Bay 2 days earlier. On board with him were William Lloyd and Daniel Casey, and the 3 men had planned to do some fishing, intending to sell their catch and the potatoes to the miners in Fabergé. Close to the boat, investigators found evidence of a campfire and a meal that had been cooked, but despite an investigation that lasted 8 years, nothing more was found, and the fate of the 5 men remains an unsolved mystery. Van Meter, a small town located in Iowa, has been the subject of a strange mystery that has been debated in the area for more than a century. In 1903, a man named U.G. Griffith was awoken by a spotlight shining into his room. Annoyed, he decided to investigate and found that the light was coming from the rooftop of a nearby building. But as he approached the light, a massive winged creature jumped to a rooftop across the street and disappeared. The next evening, the town's doctor, Dr. Alcott, had a similar experience when he too was awoken by a bright light shining into his window. He grabbed a firearm and decided to investigate, but to his surprise, he saw a bat-winged humanoid creature shining the light from a horn on its forehead. He took aim and fired at the creature 5 times, finding his mark but having no effect on it whatsoever. He decided to retreat back into his house. As news of the creature spread, one man, Clarence Dunn, decided to keep watch, believing that the light was actually caused by burglars. At around 1 a.m., he heard a strange strangling noise outside his house, and as he opened the door, he was struck in the face by the bright light. He managed to catch a glimpse of the strange creature and fired at it, also finding his mark but doing no damage. The next morning, he found a strange set of 3-toed footprints, but he decided to preserve them in the form of plaster casts, though they were lost and have never been found. Over the course of 3 days, more sightings of the winged creature were reported. The first was by a shop owner who saw it perched on a telephone pole. When he fired his weapon at it, however, it released a terrible smell and flew towards an old coal mine outside of town. When strange noises were reported at the mine, several people decided to hunt for the creature, and when they arrived, found that it was accompanied by a similar smaller creature. However, their firearms once again had no effect, and the decision was made to close the mine up for good. Whether the creatures still dwell within remains an unsolved mystery. For much of Britain, the Blitz was the darkest historical event in recent history. In Liverpool, it also uncovered another dark history story that had gone unnoticed for decades. It was 1945 when 3 boys playing with a metal cylinder on a demolished site made a dark discovery. The cylinder was a little over 6 feet in length and 20 inches in diameter. It had been rolled into the area a few weeks earlier by some other children playing, and it had been used as a bench by others. One end was sealed with a metal disc, but the other had been crushed. One of the boys managed to break open the cylinder and found a shoe. The shoe was attached to a human foot. Police were called and began the investigation into what would be dubbed the body in the cylinder. At first, it was thought that this was an unfortunate man who had perished during the Blitz a few years earlier. The cylinder had been removed from a demolished site by American soldiers, clearing a site on Boundary Street East in 1941. Investigators thought the victim must have sought shelter in the pipe, which was then sealed during the attack. It was soon discovered this man had passed away long before this dark event. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and a postcard found on him dated to 1885. 2 diaries from the 1880s were also discovered, though they were mostly unreadable. It seemed clear this man had been in the cylinder since the 1880s, and had gone unnoticed for nearly 60 years. The most valuable clue to the man's identity was a railway advice note from June of 1885. It had been written on a billhead from a paint and varnish company called T.C. Williams & Co. The name of the company gave investigators trying to solve this dark mystery something to work with. They discovered that T.C. Williams referred to Thomas Cregan Williams. Williams had declared bankruptcy in March of 1884 and had disappeared from the historical record in 1885. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for people who wanted to start a new life to work aboard ships to pay their way for passage to America. As Williams had a lot of people who he owed money to, it would make sense that he tried to escape his old life. But now investigators thought something much darker had happened to the man. The cylinder had no traces of paint residue on it. It wasn't part of a machine, and it wasn't an industrial accident that had taken the man's life. Investigators theorized it had been a ventilation tube at the paint factory, which Williams had crawled into to sleep as he was trying to hide from his creditors. The fumes had likely taken his life, and for some reason he hadn't been discovered. However, the coroner couldn't be certain this was the actual Thomas Williams, or that this theory was correct. A darker theory suggested that Williams had faked his own passing with the body and fled to America, not realizing he'd hidden the body somewhere that nobody would look. No family members of Williams were found at the time of the inquest, and the dark history case officially remains unsolved. In 1991, divers exploring a site off the coast of New Jersey discovered a strange, unexplained wreckage 60 miles out to sea. The wreckage was nicknamed the U-Hoo, and discovering its dark history was a costly mission. The wreckage was first discovered by a fisherman via sonar. It was at a depth of 240 feet and would need extremely skilled divers to go and explore it. This was much deeper than amateur divers could go. In September of 1991, a group of deep wreck divers began to explore the wreck. It looked extremely unfamiliar to them. It wasn't anything like what they'd been expecting, but shining a light over the strange angles and a hatch revealed a torpedo. It was a submarine, and it wasn't long before the crew determined it was a German U-boat from the Second World War. During this dark history period, German U-boats would patrol the US East Coast and sink merchant ships on their way to take supplies to Europe. Many of these boats were destroyed by the US military. There were two sites relatively close to where the U-boat was found. One was 150 miles north and east of this site, and one was 110 miles south. But it was deemed virtually impossible for either of those boats to be the mysterious U-Hoo. Researchers went through the archives of this dark history period to try to find the identity of the mysterious submarine, but there was no record of any sinkings that could explain the boat. Finding the true history story of this mystery would require divers to head to the boat again. The dive team completed numerous dives to the boat. It was extremely dangerous, and 3 people lost their lives while exploring the wreck, but the quest to find the truth continued. The first piece of evidence that pointed to the identity of the submarine was a small dining utensil. In the handle was carved the name Horenberg. Going through the archives, Horenberg was identified as Martin Horenberg, who worked in the radio room of the U-869. There was only one problem with this. The U-869 sank off the coast of Gibraltar. The U-869 had been patrolling the coast of the US in 1945, but received orders to go to Morocco. There, on February 28th, American and French ships reported the sinking of a U-boat. There was no physical evidence of the wreckage, but when America discovered that the U-869 had been lost, it was assumed that this was the ship that was sunk near Gibraltar. The divers uncovered more artifacts, including schematics and an escape log. Then, in August of 1997, John Chatterton received a small wooden box from the sub's motor room. It was incredibly dangerous to reach and required taking off the oxygen tank, but John managed to get in and out without any trouble. On the box was a small tag, which clearly identified the boat as the U-869. Either the boat hadn't received the orders to go ahead to Africa, or it ignored them and stayed put. How it was sunk remains a mystery. One suggestion is that it was hit by one of its own torpedoes, which unfortunately wasn't unheard of for submarines at the time. Another suggestion is that it was sunk by Allied forces, but for some reason the wreck wasn't recorded. The Connecticut shoebox case is one of the oldest cases in America. The true crime story dates back to 1886. No clues that could solve this historical mystery have ever been uncovered. The crime was uncovered in August of 1886. A group of local residents were walking along wooded farmland just outside of Wallingford, Connecticut. One of them had his dog with him. The dog started acting strangely as they came across a wooden box that looked as if it had fallen off a cart. The lettering on the outside of the box stated that it had once contained a dozen pairs of men's shoes. But that wasn't what was discovered when the men pried the box open. Instead, they made a disturbing discovery of a human torso. It was a male torso wrapped in tar paper and straw. The limbs and head were all missing. There were no identifying marks on the man's torso, or any clues as to his identity. A medical examiner investigating the case claimed the man was between 30 and 40 years old, and had passed away 5 to 10 days earlier. A large amount of arsenic was found in his stomach, and it was determined that the cause for his passing was poisoning. The arms and legs of the victim were found in September, not far from where the torso was discovered. The head was never uncovered. There were many theories about who this man was and what had caused his untimely demise. One theory was that the man was Arthur Cooley, a local man who had recently gone missing. He had disappeared shortly after retiring and collecting his pension. Cooley had a history of drinking and gambling, and it seemed possible that had led him to running into trouble. But Cooley was found alive a few days after the shoebox case was found. Other theories were that the man was responsible for a series of fires, and he'd been taken out to keep the identities of his accomplices a secret, or that he was possibly responsible for the Haymarket riots. The box was traced to a factory in Massachusetts, which had sent the box to a dealer in Chicago who sent it to a local retailer. The retailer had left the box in his yard for a few months before he sold it to a man who then disappeared a few weeks before the gruesome discovery was made. No answers to this dark history mystery were ever uncovered, and it officially remains a cold case that will likely never be solved. It's often said that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own oceans. There are things lurking beneath the sea that remain hidden from science and are still unexplained. One of these things made itself known to the US Navy in a scary history story. The event took place in 1978. The exact location is unknown, but in one source from 1980, the incident is said to have taken place near the equator, in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America. The USS Stein was on a routine patrol when the radar system used to identify submarines suddenly malfunctioned. The men aboard the ship were getting no readings. While there were no known threats in the Stein area, being at sea with no way of detecting submarines was not something anybody wanted to risk. The ship made its way back to a dry dock, where the cause for the problem was quickly discovered. The coating on the outside of the sonar dome had been completely shredded. Large tears covered 8% of its surface, and it looked like a swarm of alligators had decided to attack the sonar. Each tear had a tooth or claw at the bottom of it. A Navy biologist was brought in to try to find an answer to this strange mystery. He concluded that the claws left behind were responsible for the tears, and they seemed to come from a giant squid. The only problem with this conclusion is that the squid would have to be half the size of the Statue of Liberty to cause such huge tears. Today, researchers believe this was an attack by a colossal squid. Colossal squids can be up to 46 feet in length. While this would still be smaller than the creature the Navy biologist assumed was responsible for the damage, the different proportions between a giant squid and a colossal squid could explain the difference. Colossal squids are some of the most mysterious creatures in our oceans. Some of the largest specimens have only been uncovered after their beaks were found in the stomachs of whales, so it's possible even larger ones exist. The only issue with the colossal squid solution to this strange history mystery is the fact that the squids normally live in the Southern Ocean surrounding Antarctica. If the Stein was in equatorial waters, the squid would have been a long way from home. Whatever the exact cause of the mysterious incident, it's certain that there is more beneath the sea than we currently understand. The disappearance of the Flying Tiger Flight 739 is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries from the Vietnam War. Taking place in 1962, the dark history mystery claimed the lives of 107 people and has never been explained. Flying Tiger Flight 739 was a Lockheed Super Constellation plane traveling from California to Saigon in South Vietnam. Normally, Flying Tiger flights carried cargo rather than people, but this one had been specially charted by the US Navy. The only cargo that was carried were the luggage belonging to the people on board. The plane was carrying 93 US soldiers, 3 South Vietnamese soldiers, and a crew of 11 people. The US soldiers were mostly communication specialists with experience in the jungle. Sources differ as to whether they were on a secret mission or simply heading to Vietnam to train South Vietnamese troops. The flight left Travis Air Force Base at 5:45 on March 14, 1962. On its way, it was scheduled to stop in Honolulu, Wake Island Airfield, Guam, and Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The first 3 stops took place without issue. In Hawaii and on Wake Island, there were some maintenance works, but it was primarily refueling that took place. In Guam, the plane was refueled again. It took off at 12:57 on March 15th. The Philippines were a little over 6 hours away, and the plane had enough fuel for 9 hours and 30 minutes. But an unexplained mystery happened somewhere over the Pacific, and the plane never reached the Philippines. Between 1325 and 1422, Flight 739 made 4 messages to Guam International Flight Service. They were regular messages requesting permission to climb to 18,000 feet and reporting their progress. They were all normal messages, and air traffic control had no reason to believe they wouldn't radio in at 15:30 for their regular update. The 15:30 message never came. While talking to another flight, Guam International Flight Service Station received heavy radio static around that time, but no messages from Flight 739 came through. Repeated attempts to contact the plane were made, but nothing was received. Search teams were sent to get to the bottom of this mystery, but no evidence was ever found to explain what had happened. An oil tanker sailing in the Pacific reported seeing an intensely bright explosion at about 15:30 in an area which would have been close to where Flight 739 was supposed to be. But no oil slick or debris was ever found. An investigation into the disappearance of Flight 739 has turned up no answers. One explanation for this dark history mystery is sabotage. In Honolulu and Guam, the area where the plane was parked could be accessed by anybody, and it would have been possible for something to be slipped on board. But without any debris or the wreck itself, it's only possible to speculate about the cause for this dark history story. In 1994, an unbelievable coincidence threatened to derail one of the most secretive operations during the Second World War. The D-Day invasion would put the Allied forces back on the continent and was the start of the end of the war in Europe. Strict security measures were put into place to make sure that German forces were unaware of the plans. Part of that meant sending counterintelligence to convince the Germans the invasion would take place in Calais. Another part was the code words used to talk about the mission. Everything from the planned landing beaches to the equipment used had its own code name. The Canadian and British forces gave their beaches code names related to fish. The Americans decided to give their beaches more dignified-sounding names, naming them after American states and cities. So it wasn't too much of a coincidence when a crossword in a British national paper used one of those words as a solution. May 2nd, 1944, the solution for 17 across in the Daily Telegraph crossword was Utah. That alone wouldn't have been too strange. Even though it was a month before the planned D-Day landings, it was a small coincidence. 20 days later, a crossword in the same newspaper used the code word for another landing beach. On May 27th, Overlord was featured in another Telegraph crossword. Overlord was the name given to the entire D-Day operation. The May 30th crossword featured the word mulberry, the code word for the portable harbors that would be used. The following day, Neptune was a solution. Neptune was the name for the landing operations. At this point, MI5 was extremely alarmed. One or two of these words cropping up was a coincidence, but now it seemed like someone was trying to tell the Axis forces something. What's more, this wasn't the first time the Daily Telegraph crossword looked like a security risk. 2 years earlier, the word Dieppe was featured in the crossword. The next day, Allied forces launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was a disaster as the Germans had well-prepared defenses ready for the attack. After the incident, the creator of the crossword had been brought in. Leonard Daw was a school principal and World War I veteran who'd been making crosswords in his spare time. He was interrogated after the Dieppe incident, but it was deemed to have simply been a coincidence. It would turn out Daw was the same person responsible for this new wave of suspicious crosswords. Daw was again interrogated, but he insisted he had no insider knowledge. After a search of his home, it was again deemed to have been a strange, unsettling coincidence. For 40 years, that was the conclusion, but it still seemed too strange to be true. Then, in 1984, one of Daw's former pupils came forward. Ronald French had been 14 years old at the time and claimed that Daw often let his pupils pick words for his puzzles. The school was located near an American Army camp, and French had heard the code words while hanging out with the soldiers there. He hadn't realized the significance of the words, but thought that they would be an interesting addition to his teacher's puzzles. After Daw was interrogated, he demanded to know where the words had come from. French revealed the truth, and Daw allegedly burned the notebooks that French had used to write down the code words. Whether or not French's story was true, it was a series of strange coincidences that put those words into a national paper, and the same national paper that had already been the subject of a strange crossword coincidence during the war. When someone survives 2 experiences that would have normally claimed their lives, that's a strange coincidence. When the total becomes 7 such near misses, it seems a little more unbelievable. But that's allegedly what happened to Frano Selak. Frano was a Croatian man who tried to live a simple life as a music teacher. He was born in 1929, and for the first 33 years of his life, nothing especially out of the ordinary happened. But in 1962, a freak accident almost cost him his life. Frano was traveling by train, and as the train passed by a river, it derailed. Frano and countless other passengers plunged into the icy waters. Frano wounded his arm in the fall, but managed to swim to the riverbanks. Suffering from hypothermia, it looked like Frano's life may have ended there in a tragic accident. Miraculously, he managed to survive. The next year, Frano was forced to travel by plane to visit his mother. He didn't like flying, and given his recent brush with tragedy, it would make sense why he was so hesitant to board a plane. But his mother was ill and he needed to be at her side. The earliest flight he could get was sold out, but he managed to convince the airline to let him sit at the back of the plane with the stewardess. It was a decision that may have saved his life. Toward the end of the flight, one of the exterior doors flew. Frano was dragged out of the plane. Luckily, he landed in a haystack which cushioned his fall and allowed him to survive his second terrifying travel accident. It was the most dramatic of Frano's fantastic survival stories, but not the last. Over the next 30 years or so, he would survive a bus crash, his car erupting into flames twice, being struck by a bus, and driving off of a cliff to avoid an oncoming driver. In the last instance, he managed to jump out of the car at the last minute and hold on to a tree. Frano described himself as either the unluckiest or the luckiest man alive. It seemed like the latter was the case when he won the lottery in 2002. It was then that he decided to tell the media his strange story. How much, if any, of Frano's story is real has never been proven. Frano himself never profited from his amazing story, but the series of strange coincidences captured the imaginations of people around the world. Writers and artists are often inspired by events going on around them, but the similarities between a 1951 novel by Norman Mailer and what was going on in the apartment building he lived were purely a coincidence. Barbary Shore was Mailer's second novel. It was about a World War II veteran living in an apartment building in Brooklyn. The book wasn't as well received as his previous novel or the ones that would come after it, but it's since become famous due to the strange coincidence that would emerge years later. The novel takes place entirely in the apartment building where the protagonist lives. The protagonist is a writer suffering from amnesia. All the other characters are other people who live in the apartment block. There's the landlady, her daughter, and a few other lodgers. According to Mailer, one of the lodgers developed a lot as he wrote the novel. The character was initially a minor character but got more and more important as the novel developed. Mailer described the novel as if someone else was using him to write it, and it wasn't coming to his own head. That would be strange, but inspiration out of nowhere isn't uncommon for artists. The character in question was a Russian spy who possessed an object wanted by an undercover police officer also living in the building. What that object was is not revealed in the novel. 6 years later, a spy working for the Soviet Union was arrested. Rudolf Abel had been working for the KGB since the 1940s. In 1950, he moved to New York, where he claimed to be an artist while working as part of a spy ring. He would allegedly transfer messages using hollowed-out coins. In 1953, one of those coins was discovered, but it wouldn't be until 1957 that the message was decoded and Abel connected to it. Abel had lived in an apartment building in Brooklyn at one point, which would be a strange coincidence by itself. But he allegedly also lived in the same building as Mailer, while Mailer wrote Barbary Shore. Mailer claimed to have no knowledge of his neighbor's secret life, but was open to the idea that he might have unconsciously, telepathically, picked up on the details for his book. Today, the American Secret Service is known around the world for protecting America's commander-in-chief. But one of the strangest coincidences in the history of the organization is that it began the day its creator was attacked. After the horrors of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln knew there was a threat against his life. There had been multiple failed attempts by the end of the Civil War, and he knew that the South's surrender wouldn't make his life any easier. He employed bodyguards that were supposed to protect him from further attempts. Famously, on April 14, 1865, the man employed for that job was unsuccessful. Also on April 14th, Lincoln created the Secret Service. This wasn't out of some paranoia about attempts on his life, and the bodyguard on duty that night wasn't a member of the Secret Service. It was entirely by coincidence that the organization that would one day go on to protect the life of the president was created that day. The Secret Service wasn't originally created for protecting anybody. It was an organization to stop counterfeiters. By 1865, at least a third of the currency in the United States was fake. Some estimates place that at up to 50%. The money was easy to counterfeit, and those that were successful earned hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the request of the Secretary of the Treasury, Lincoln set up a commission to investigate the extent of counterfeiting and what could be done to stop it. The solution was to create a federal law enforcement agency to crack down on counterfeiting. At the time, there was no such thing as the FBI or anything similar, so this new agency would be the first of its kind. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln signed into law the legislation that would create the Secret Service Division of the Department of Treasury. It would be one of his last acts as president. For the next few years, the Secret Service's mission remained the same. Gradually, it became responsible for investigating all fraud against the US government, and became more and more powerful. It wouldn't be until William McKinley was attacked and passed away in 1901 that protecting the president himself would finally become the responsibility of the Secret Service. Since the 1940s, panda diplomacy has been a way for China to engage with the rest of the world. The so-called Panda Curse began in 1972. Richard Nixon became the first sitting US president to visit the People's Republic of China in a long-planned visit to the country in February of that year. During the visit, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai offered Nixon a pair of pandas after learning Nixon's wife Pat loved the species. Ling Ling and Sing Sing arrived in the US 2 months later and resided at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years. The two pandas were a big hit in the US, and China was apparently keen to reuse this tactic. A few months later, Japanese Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka had meetings with his Chinese counterpart as relations between the two neighboring countries normalized following World War II. Like Nixon, he ended the visit by receiving a gift of two pandas. As in the US, the two pandas became celebrities in Japan, and it caught the attention of other politicians. In particular, former UK Prime Minister Edward Heath was so keen to bring pandas back to London that he actually asked for the animals during a diplomatic meeting in 1974. The Chinese government was happy to help. It was around this time that the consequences of the panda curse began to unfold. In the US, the Watergate scandal was already well underway. By the end of 1974, Nixon, the first victim of the panda curse, would resign as president. Meanwhile, in Japan, Tanaka resigned in November of 1974, after a number of shady business dealings came to light. Finally, Edward Heath's year turned from bad to worse when he lost a second general election in less than 10 months. He was forced out of his position as the head of the Conservative Party at the start of 1975. Since then, countless other politicians and countries have accepted pandas as gifts or on loan from China. Most haven't fallen into a political scandal, and it does seem like the panda curse was more of a strange historic coincidence, but one that still comes up every so often. For example, the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 took place just a month before Malaysia was scheduled to accept 2 pandas from China. The panda curse, or coincidence, lives on. Anyone who's ever been in a bad mood might claim to have woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Few people know this unique expression has a creepy history dating back to Roman times. Keep in mind, the scary stories you're about to hear were once considered completely acceptable scientific explanations. Throughout history, Romans believed that getting out of the right side of the bed was literally the only safe way to begin the day, without greatly displeasing the gods. In their civilization, anyone who wrote with their left hand, put their left shoe on first, or even walked into a house leading with their left foot was tempting a fate most evil. Of course, waking up on the left side of the bed, or rather the wrong side, was no exception to this rule. These ancient history stories might seem weird to us in modern times, but such myths were considered 100% fact to Romans, who believed that the left side of the body was routinely used for all things sinister. In fact, sinister is the Latin word for left. Dexter is the Latin word for right. Over the centuries, these stories from ancient history gave way to more modern urban legends. Literal demons were thought to be waiting on the left side of the bed to wrong anyone who passes by. Although the association of the left side of the bed with wrongness has gradually faded away since the fall of the Roman Empire, the common expression remains a world-famous saying to this day. As a side note, the ancient battle of Sinister and Dexter is the historic reason why, in traditional stories and folklore, there's always a devil on the left shoulder and an angel on the right. To bury the hatchet is a common phrase which in modern times means to make peace. The saying comes from the historical tradition among Native Americans in which 2 chiefs would come together to literally bury their hatchet, oftentimes the very same weapon that was used against each other in battle, thus ending a dark history of conflict between tribes. Exactly when the tradition of burying the hatchet began, or how widely it was actually practiced in times past, is an unknown mystery to history experts. One possible story to explain the origin of this famous expression is from a true history event in which the Native American leaders convinced 5 major nations to form an alliance. Legends of this time period tell of history's greatest Native American leaders gathering to bury their weapons under a white pine tree in celebration of their new alliance. What happened next is where Native American folklore and true history most likely blur. According to legend, when the hatchets were buried, the event caused a giant underground river to wash the weapons to a secret place far away so that they could never again cause war. 17th century European settlers documented this practice of burying the hatchet upon their arrival to North America. History stories from the French documents report that in 1644, one tribe visiting the Canadian city of Quebec wished to peacefully hurl the hatchet so far into the depths of the earth that it shall never again be seen in the future, as was their custom at the time. Similarly, a famous historical figure in Massachusetts named Samuel Sewall also wrote of an event in 1680 where he witnessed an agreement between the Mohawk tribe and English settlers, solidified by the ceremonial burial of 2 axes. By the 18th century, the phrase had become commonplace despite its rather dark history. Today, the expression describes successfully resolving all conflicts, large or small, even though the true history behind the phrase remains largely unknown to most people who still make use of it. "The walls have ears" is a famous expression warning people to speak carefully because their private conversation is being monitored. This phrase may have once had a much more straightforward meaning based on a weird history story dating back thousands of years. A strange but true story of Dionysus, the ruler of Syracuse from 432 to 367 BC, tells of an unusual limestone formation below his palace. The properties of this cave formed a narrow tunnel that widened into a large cavern, a natural shape with tremendous acoustics not unlike the inner workings of the human ear. According to the Roman scholar Cicero, Dionysus constructed the limestone walls into an advanced architectural eavesdropping device called Dionysus's ear. The echoing caverns allowed him to sneak around listening to private conversations as they traveled through the tunnels from the palace's rooms above. Throughout history, the weird echo chamber was said to connect to a giant underground prison as well. In the darkest version of this story, historians suggest that the ear was not meant for eavesdropping, but rather to amplify the wails and screams of his prisoners. As with many weird stories, history repeats itself in the strangest of ways. Thousands of years later, the de' Medici family, 15th century Italian bankers and politicians, used similar spy architecture for informational gain. When the Louvre was constructed in Paris, Catherine de' Medici, the mother of the French kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, was said to have instructed builders to create acoustic ducts built into the walls of the palace. That way she could hear conversations coming from different rooms. When a visitor to this medieval palace thought the walls had ears, they meant that Catherine or one of her lackeys could be listening in from one of these alcoves. The expression white elephant is one of the more common phrases used to refer to a gift that is impractical. But as with many ancient expressions, there's a weird history story full of dark moments to explain the mystery behind this phrase. In the kingdom of Siam, located in modern-day Thailand, elephants were once valued for their size, power, and majesty. The most sacred of all were the rare white elephants. Said to be a good luck symbol of fertility and wisdom, the legend of Maya, mother of Buddha, once dreamt of a white elephant who presented her with a lotus flower on the eve of its magnificent birth. According to ancient legends, Siam royalty were known to make a gift of a white elephant, but according to these stories, the true purpose of such a gift was a secret punishment. Since it was forbidden to put a white elephant to work, there was no way for the recipient to make money off the creature. The elephant's new owners could never get rid of a gift from royalty, so selling it to market was absolutely not an option. The white elephant was effectively a beautiful burden that required intense care and a lifetime of resources to properly maintain. There are many strange but true history stories in which the white elephant would quickly eat its way through a small fortune, effectively ruining their owners without ever tarnishing the reputation of the person who gave the elephant. It was this nightmarish scenario that led to the phrase white elephant coming to mean a useless or impractical gift. Today, the common expression has evolved to include any gift regardless of intent, but historically, the unlucky recipients of these royal elephants were silently being condemned to a lifetime of poverty and struggle. To be gifted a white elephant meant a constant fear of either going poor or offending their king, sometimes even both. Anyone who has ever had to bite the bullet had no choice but to experience an unpleasant situation head-on. In 1891's The Light That Failed, written by Rudyard Kipling, one of the characters is told to bite on the bullet, old man, and don't let them think you're afraid. It's clear that this unusual phrase is more than 150 years old, but its true origins remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. According to historical war stories, in order to quiet patients on the battlefield and to protect them from biting off their own tongues, surgeons would provide a strip of leather or fabric for surgical patients to clamp down on instead. If no such materials were available, then doctors told patients to bite down on a literal bullet while they worked to save their life. This weird story is the most widely accepted explanation for this common saying. However, there exists a lesser-known alternative explanation for this historical phrase. The 1796 Classical Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which explained the weird stories behind slang and curses throughout history, provided a helpful clue in solving the mystery behind this expression. As the history story goes, a man who cries out on the battlefield when attacked was once disgracefully called a nightingale. In comparison, those who never cried out were considered far more honorable soldiers, for no one wanted to return home with the cowardly label of being a nightingale. To avoid crying out from fear and tarnishing their reputation, those on the battlefield would sometimes literally chew on a bullet instead. Whether biting the bullet was first used by hapless surgical patients or by soldiers who wanted to appear brave while under enemy attack remains a mystery. However, it's likely that this method was, at one point in the dark history of warfare, meant to protect soldiers from screaming out during the horrors of battle, which is a morbid history story for any modern-day expression to be based upon. One of the worst losses that the Royal Australian Navy had suffered occurred on the 19th of November in 1941. It had been the loss of the HMS Sydney II, which had been a light cruiser commissioned in 1934. The Sydney II had been one out of 3 modified Leander-class light cruisers that had been acquired by the Navy preceding the Second World War. At the time in Australia, these ships were known as Perth-class light cruisers. This ship had an unfortunate fate when it became lost in battle with the Cormorant, a German auxiliary cruiser. This ship's purpose had also been war and was built between 1938 and 1939. The battle occurred off the coast of Western Australia. Unfortunately, none of Sydney's crews survived, which had been 645 members. Both of the warships had sunk, and no one could find the shipwrecks for quite some time. The Sydney was described as a rather successful warship and had been the most famous out of all the Australian Navy's ships in November of 1941. The ship was elegantly designed and had made headlines with its exploits in the Mediterranean, particularly the action off Cape Spada. The Cormorant's mission, however, was designed to evade the limelight. The Cormorant had been a freighter that was armed with various weapons, of which had been disguised in order to reveal that it was not a merchant ship, only upon closer inspection. It had not been the ship's role to fight fleet actions, but rather to carry out missions alone and unescorted for a few months at a time. It's circumstances such as these that have attracted much public attention, as both ships' careers had been inverse to one another. Sydney and Cormorant had met off the coast during the afternoon of the 19th of November. The German ship was disguised so greatly that it was able to entice the Sydney to come within closer range, and once the ships were within close proximity, the Cormorant opened fire. While the Australian ship had been overwhelmed, it was able to fight back and had made sure that the warship would too be destroyed when it began to sag. With the entire loss of the Sydney's crew, the events would only be told by those who had survived on the Cormorant. These accounts ultimately led to various rumors, conspiracies, and accusations with no basis or sufficient evidence. A few days later, on the 24th of November at 5 p.m., Trocus, a British tanker, reported that 25 German crew members were rescued from a raft west to northwest of Carnarvon. This had been the first bit of evidence of the battle involving the Sydney that was overdue by 4 days. A ship was immediately dispatched and the Trocus proceeded its search while the RAAF set out on air searches and they hunted for the Sydney. On the morning of the 25th, lifeboats were spotted by the air searchers northwest of Carnarvon. Sightings on this day had totaled up to 5 boats, and later another 2 had come ashore. 318 men had been rescued belonging to the Cormorant, which had ultimately led to the fate of the Sydney. The only debris that was recovered belonging to the Australian naval ship had been a lifeboat, found 8 days after the event had taken place. The families had begun to receive telegrams of the missing ship, and for years they would not receive any closure. Conspiracy began to swirl around the loss of the Sydney. The surviving German crew members had done nothing to diminish the Australian citizens' curiosity regarding the battle. Due to the fact that the Australian ship had non-surviving members, this would lead to speculation on whether complete information had been given or not. There's been no official record of a court inquiry after the sunken ships had been discovered. This would result in the speculation that alternative events may have taken place between the Sydney and the Cormorant. Alternative events to what had been pieced together by the German survivor interrogations. There exists only a brief description of this ordeal in the Royal Australian Navy's history of the Second World War. Due to this, it's clear to see why there's persisting skepticism among the families of the Sydney's crew members. An effort was made to end these speculations when the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence and Trade of the Australian Parliament had concluded a lengthy inquiry into the loss of the Sydney during 1999. This inquiry had examined documentation relating to the event and had included the written as well as the verbal testimonies from the parties who believed they had relevant information. The committee looked into alternative battle scenarios that included allegations where a third party may have been involved. The conclusion was set forth in a 192-page report detailing that unless further evidence supports another theory, the foregoing account of the battle is the most accurate thus far. The committee had also recognized that due to the lack of testimony from Australian participants, speculation may not be put to an end. After this, there are still some questions that remain, one of which asked why Sydney's Captain Burnett had not made use of the seaplane to further investigate the oncoming ship from a distance. It's asked why the captain, who had full knowledge of German merchant raider activities, did not confirm such suspicions about the cormorant by asking the Navy office if an enemy was in the area. It's also wondered why the Sydney's crew had not been attentive and at their action stations when approaching the potential enemy ship that was not yet identified. Without further explanations or evidence, it's widely accepted that the captain had brought the Sydney too close to the German ship by a tragic mistake. Both shipwrecks of the Sydney and the Cormorant had disappeared into the depths of the ocean. The ongoing nightmare had finally ceased in 2008 when the wrecks were discovered following a search that had been the result of some dedicated individuals. After 167 years, the mystery of what happened on that fateful afternoon had finally been solved after the discovery of the wreckage. All evidence may have been lost to the waters, leaving very little information to go on, and continuing the mystery surrounding the exact events of the battle between the Sydney and the Cormorant. The charge of the Light Brigade. Was it a tactical error or a much-needed sacrifice? This is the question surrounding the events that unfolded in the 1800s. The charge of the Light Brigade refers to a failed military attack that had taken place in 1854 during the Crimean War. To understand the events that unfolded, a backpedal is needed, starting with the Crimean War that ultimately led to the charge. The war had taken place between October of 1853 and February of 1856. On one side, it was the Russians, and on the other, there was an alliance consisting of the Ottoman Empire, France, and Britain. The reasons as to why the Crimean War began is described as fiddly. It's allegedly begun due to a dispute between the rights of Christians in Palestine, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire that had been Muslim. The French had promoted Roman Catholic rights, whereas Russia had promoted the Eastern Orthodox Church. While this aspect was said to have kick-started the war, it had been attributed more to the growing dominance of Russia in Central Asia. The empire had been slowly weakening over the years, which Russia used to its advantage to claim more territory. In the 19th century, a consensus was held by the powers in Europe about the balance of power within the continent and where the borders should be. There had never been an absolute agreement, and there had been few smaller disagreements as well as jockeying for power. On the whole, though, this had helped to maintain an extended time of peace and stability within Europe after the Napoleonic Wars that had caused many years of utter chaos. France and Britain had both been relying on the empire to help maintain this exact balance of power, but as it grew weaker, Russia grew stronger, and so they waded in and became allies with the Ottoman, preceding the moving of Russian troops into Romania, formally sparking the war. The Crimean War had been the first modern war where new inventions were being used, such as railways and telegrams, that had been used tactically. Because of this, the war was one of the first to be reported on directly while it was ongoing. The first live war was reported to the Times by William Howard Russell. This had also been the first European war to have been photographed, allowing those back in France and Britain to see exactly what had been happening to their troops. Medical care from the start of the war had been inadequate for the sick and wounded. Many soldiers would go on to pass away due to preventable diseases that plagued unsanitary hospitals. This would change sometime later after the arrival of new nurses, most notably Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. They would revolutionize how the medical treatment was given and had emphasized on basic hygiene. This would later bring the importance of nursing homes to those in Britain, ultimately leading to nursing becoming a respected profession. Now that the basic background of the war has been explained, the charge of the Light Brigade can be brought to attention. The charge was a part of a larger battle that was known as the Battle of Balaclava. This battle was also part of a much larger conflict that was called the Siege of Sebastopol, lasting from 1854 to 1855. Sebastopol refers to the main Russian port that had been an important target for the opposing forces. They managed to gain an early victory against Russia, but were not quick enough to prevent them from regrouping. The Battle of Balaclava started in October of 1954, and it had been a mess on a large scale. The Ottoman forces had tried to hold the Russian forces back, but they didn't have sufficient backup, and so they retreated. The next line of defense was able to hold it and was even able to start pushing the Russians back. That was until it had all gone wrong with the charge, which had made up a chunk of the British cavalry forces within this battle. They've been useful for various important tasks. The brigade was said to have been equipped for reconnaissance as well as skirmishing against smaller enemies. They were also used to cut down infantry and artillery units, but they were not equipped to handle heavier artillery firing. The Light Brigade, consisting of 670 troopers, stormed into the valley right at the main Russian artillery battery, which was equipped with extra cannons on either side, which had quite clearly been a terrible idea and certainly erroneous. Despite the dangers, the troops filed in without having questioned why they had been instructed to ride directly into imminent threat, beyond what they were known to be able to handle. The Light Brigade was able to reach the end of the valley, and was even able to force the Russians away from the area in which the weapons were being fired from. The casualties included 118 men and 362 horses. 127 of the troopers had been critically injured, and so the brigade was forced back. Only 195 of the 670 cavalry still had their horses by the end of the charge. It had been a large loss which ultimately left the Allies incapable of any further conflict that day. This event had subsequently gone down in history, with the Russians assuming that the brigade had been somewhat intoxicated to have done something so incredibly dangerous. The ordered charge was found to be the subject of a catastrophic misunderstanding. The main commander of the army, Lord Raglan, allegedly sent orders to the brigade to initiate an attack on the weaponry on the side of the valley, the side where the Russians were in the process of retreating, which was above the skill set of the men. Lord Raglan was able to see the whole battlefield, but the cavalry commander, the Earl of Lucan, did not see that the Russians had been preparing to retreat, and therefore didn't know what the exact target had been. To make matters significantly worse, Raglan's message had been delivered to the commander, and the messenger, Captain Nolan, had added an extra bit onto the message. He made emphasis that the cavalry should attack immediately. This meant that Lucan rushed instead of sending a message back to Raglan for clarification, and had instead asked Nolan what weaponry they were meant to attack. As stated in the records, Nolan had allegedly answered with a sweep of his arm, referring to the mass of Russian artillery at the end of the valley, a mile away instead of on the side of the valley. No one is quite certain as to why Nolan would botch this information to this extent, since he himself made up one of the casualties in the charge himself. Since he was declared deceased, it may never be known as to why he had done this, but the miscommunication was accepted by the commander, who sent the brigade off on this dangerous and fatal task. A single soldier's error had gone unquestioned, and subsequently led to a critical loss of soldiers. None of the cavalry had picked up on this error either. The exact reasoning behind this misinformation is not entirely known, or if it had been purposeful or not. A name that was inspired by Pima Native American legends, the Superstition Mountains, have been found to be a documented source of mystery since the early days. The mountainous area is decorated with ancient cliff dwellings and caves that show evidence of former habitation. It's uncertain as to who these inhabitants may have been, but some theorize that they could have been either Salado or Oaxacan Native Americans who had populated this area of Arizona some time ago. After this, the Pimas and the Apaches had come to occupy certain parts as well. The name Apache had become associated with the Superstition Mountains, and it would become their stronghold during the 1800s. In the 1940s, the Peralta family of the northern part of Mexico allegedly made a rich gold mine in the Superstitions. In 1948, they were said to have had their last expedition, where they carried gold back to Mexico. The legend states that the expedition party was ambushed by the Apaches who inhabited the area, and that all their lives had been taken except for 2 members of the Peralta family, who were able to make their escape to Mexico. The area is known as the Massacre Grounds. It was alleged that there were numerous other individuals who had known the location of the mine or had worked in it. Various maps have since surfaced, only to be conveniently lost or misplaced when pressed for facts by those who become interested. Men who had made claims that they'd found the Peralta mine were not able to find it again, or there would be some sort of disaster before they could file their claim, all of which adds to the lore of the lost Dutchman's gold mine. Jacob Waltz, the Dutchman, who was actually a native German, claimed to have located the mine in the 1870s while assisted by a Peralta descendant. Waltz and Jacob Weiser worked in the mine and allegedly hid some caches of gold in the mountains. Most of the legends place these caches somewhere in the area of Weaver's Needle, a famous landmark. Weiser had too met his demise through the Apaches, but some theorized that he'd befallen a victim of Waltz. Waltz had later moved to Phoenix, where he would pass away in 1891 due to failing health. Apparently, he had told Julia Thomas, a neighbor, the location of the mine. Julia had taken care of Waltz prior to his passing. She, as well as many other seekers, were unable to find the lost Dutchman mine in the following years. Some of the seekers had subsequently been met with foul play, which at times could be fatal. This ultimately led to the superstitions and mystery surrounding the mountains. There are various versions of the lost Dutchman mine that are said to exist. There have been books and films that have made use of these lores as their subject. These mountains have acted as a beacon for the curious treasure hunters who are attracted there from all corners of the world. Fortunes have been both made and lost in the search for the mine, but the mine was never found. Herman Petrasch had been one of the more persistent searchers for Jacob Waltz's gold. Herman and his brother Reinhard had started their search along with the aforementioned Julia Thomas in 1892. Herman had become intertwined in the search by request of Reinhard, who had asked him if he could assist him and Julia in the search. It's said that Reinhard had made the claim that he and Julia had clues as to where the gold mine was located. Strangely enough, Reinhard had been helping Julia with her business and is believed to have become closely associated with Waltz in his final days. It's suggested that this is where he had learned some vague clues, and it's alleged that Waltz had mumbled out some clues in those days, most of which were directed at Julia and not Reinhard. It was told that as he neared his end, Waltz had called the two to his side and told them what the clues had been for them to find the gold mine. The two would have been able to remember this information if it wasn't for them becoming too celebratory, resulting in foggy memories. This, of course, was regretted later, while they wandered about the mountains aimlessly. After Waltz had passed, the two friends would spend some time trying to piece the clues together. The first decision they'd made was to include a third party that they could trust. This had been Herman, who was living in Colorado. He arrived in Phoenix in 1892, where the three would begin to plan out the expedition. Julia had formed a team, wagon, as well as camping gear. Later, they'd found that both the wagon and the arranged team had been a mistake, and so the three had left Phoenix that August. By the end of the first day, camp was set along the Salt River, and on the second day, they traveled eastward toward the west facade of Superstition Mountain. By the time they reached the more mountainous terrain, they ultimately found that the team and the wagon were useless. The realization led them to pack up the team and the wagon. The following morning, they packed the horses and headed for the northwestern end of the mountain. Herman alleged that they would then set up camp in Needle Canyon, north of Weaver's Needle. Initially, the team was in high spirits for their expedition, but the summer heat had begun to take its toll on them. By the end of the third week of the expedition, they collapsed due to exhaustion and the lack of food and water. Thereafter, the search for the lost mine was abandoned. The team returned to Phoenix defeated. Arizona Weekly Gazette, a local newspaper, detailed the expedition, saying, quote, "A queer quest, another lost mine being hunted by a woman." This ultimately led Julia to financial ruin. She and her brothers had no source of income nor a place to live. Julia would later leave the brothers behind to marry a farm laborer, Albert Schaefer. Albert is important to the story because he had encouraged his wife to make maps with the information that she could remember. This caused Julia to become very resourceful and ultimately produced some incredible maps that illustrated how to find the lost gold mine. These had been the first maps that may have led to the Dutchman's gold mine. As for Reinhard, he worked around Phoenix before departing to Globe, where he worked as a caretaker. He was also known as Old Pete in Globe and Miami. Herman had various jobs where he would work for cattlemen around the Superstition Mountain. He was described as a great carpenter and had worked on the ranch. Many individuals are said to have written various articles about Herman and his search for the lost mine. It's found that around 8,000 people a year try to find this legendary mine but fail. One such person had even included the Arizona Attorney General. Edward Leedskalnin, a Latvian-American man, had begun to build a rather strange castle in the 1920s. The castle was created out of giant stones and was situated between the towns of Homestead and Leisure City in South Florida. As the name suggests, the castle is made of coral in some way. It's formed from a sedimentary rock that's known as oolite limestone, which is a porous rock that consists of layered carbonate, of which can contain fossilized corals. Edward had spent a large portion of his life honing this incredible structure in which he had lived. When he was pressed about how he had been building such an impressive work all by himself, he would give some rather cagey answers. From the very day that Edward had begun the creation of the Coral Castle up until the modern days, people have been absolutely fascinated by the work as well as the man himself. This event is often added to the list of strange structures that could never be explained. It's said that Edward had made this build in secret and under the cover of the evening darkness, in which he would somehow lift, carve, move, and place 1,100 tons of stone blocks by himself. Additionally, the stones would be aligned perfectly and have been left intact for decades. While it may look just like a plain stone garden today, Coral Castle is much more intricate than it may appear. Today, the creation is owned by a company and is a popular tourist attraction. Coral Palace was the name attributed to it at a later stage, and it was initially called Ed's Palace. There are various mysteries surrounding the creation, one of which is that he was able to move the castle over 10 miles. Originally, the structure was built in Florida City when Edward had purchased a property, but after a new subdivision emerged in the area in 1936, he would move his entire castle some 10 miles away to Homestead. He moved it piece by piece and added to it over the years until his passing in 1951. He had also settled on the name Rockgate because of the Rockgate entrance. Another mystery surrounding the Coral Castle is how exactly Edward was able to achieve it. There have been various theories that have come about this, ranging from magnetism to levitation to outright magic. When Edward had been asked how he had accomplished this, he would mysteriously respond, saying that he had extensive knowledge that encompassed leverage and weight. Another common answer that he would give was that he had knowledge of the secrets of the pyramids. Sometimes he stated that he harnessed these secrets to further support the mystery surrounding this structure. But he did have a tool shed consisting mostly of pulleys and various hand tools, but this simply doesn't explain every aspect of how the castle was built. What's even more strange is that Edward had only finished 4th grade. He was not wealthy and had been a sickly child, having had tuberculosis various times throughout his life. Among the creations within this castle, Edward had made out of stone a 9-ton gate that can swing open by the touch of a finger, a table that's shaped as geographically correct Florida, including an 8-inch indentation said to represent Lake Okeechobee, which is kept filled up, a 20-ton and 20-foot tall telescope, and a circular-shaped cutout that points to the North Star, a sundial that tells time as well as indicates equinoxes and solstices. Additionally, a throne room had been built which features a collection of chairs, one of which is called the Mad Rocker, where 2 people sit facing one another and rock, and another was called Mother-in-Law, which is found to be the most uncomfortable chair. There's also a feature that's called the world's largest Valentine, that was found to be a 2.5-ton heart-shaped table along with benches that are said to have been in honor of his fiancée, who left him in Latvia in 1915. The story went that the fiancé, who was 16 years old, had decided that Edward, who was 27, was far too old for her, and had broken up with him the very evening that they were due to be married. The heartbroken man would then travel through Canada, Washington, and California before finding himself in Florida City. A book had later been written by Joe Bullard called Waiting for Agnes, which was about Edward and the years that he spent living in the castle. Joe alleged that he'd spent around 16 years researching the case, resulting in a printout that's rather difficult to get a hold of. It's also believed that Edward had made this castle in hopes that his long-lost love would come to America and see the beautiful castle and agree to marry him. It was theorized that the castle had actually been built for her. According to the book, though, he'd received a note from an acquaintance in Latvia detailing that the woman had gone to Ireland, where she married someone else who she'd fallen in love with prior to ever having met Edward. The woman had children and became a widow and was said to have lived until the 1980s, but this is a difficult feature to authenticate. Edward later opened his structure to the public in 1920, and it had been mentioned in the 1939 WPA Guide to Florida. In the same year, he opted for more visibility and fortune that never materialized, and so he moved the immense structure to where it is now, using a wagon and a mule. He hauled the colossal pieces over 10 miles and then put them in their place, and it's uncertain how exactly he had accomplished this. Edward was himself an enigma, and had claimed to know the secrets as to how the pyramids, as well as Stonehenge, had been built. The size and weight of the stones that were used, along with the mystery that surrounds how it had been done, led to the structure being referred to as America's Stonehenge. It was rumored that the creator had extensive knowledge of magnets and how they worked. He was even said to have written a book titled Magnetic Current. It's been claimed that Edward had applied for a patent for a magnetic motor that he said could work forever. It was discovered that the man had a magnetic flywheel in the castle that still resides there, but parts of it have been removed. When Edward had not gotten a patent, he became open about his plans for the motor and allegedly had used it as a power truck. It was theorized that Edward made use of magnetism to levitate the stones with the use of a magnetic generator to create electricity that would affect the magnetism found within the large stones. Others believed that he understood ley lines and their energy within the earth. But despite these claims, the book that he wrote was rather difficult to figure out, and it seems he took his magnet secrets with him to the grave. Ever since its discovery, the Gate of the Sun has baffled researchers, archaeologists, and experts. Aside from the famous archaeological sites such as Machu Picchu, there are some other creations that have been subject to cutting-edge masonry and architecture by an ancient society. There are various sites that are strewn across western Bolivia, Peru, and Chile from 300 to 1150 AD. It's said that the pre-Hispanic culture had reached its peak between 500 and 900 AD. These creations serve as a reminder of a whole other civilization that once inhabited America. The Gate of the Sun can be found in Tiwanaku City, which is set at an altitude of 12,500 feet near Lake Titicaca, in what's now called Bolivia. Some pieces of evidence had pointed to the possible existence of a more modern city that's still one of ancient. The Tiwanaku culture had been from a settlement that had later evolved into a city sometime between the 5th and 9th centuries. Some evidence is suggestive that the strange enigmatic structures had served religious purposes and provided a well-developed infrastructure for everyday life, including an underground system for drainage. Various structures have been traced back to many different periods. Some such structures include the Pyramid of Akapana, which had consisted of 7 platforms and stood at a height of 60 feet. Close to this structure, there was another discovery that was made by European explorers in the 19th century. This discovery had surprised researchers and those who have put their minds to learning about these ancient civilizations. The discovery was of a temple, which is believed to have been an observatory. It's surrounded by many other structures and monolithic structures, including the Gate of the Sun, the most significant remains of Tiwanaku art. The structure had been carved from an incredible chunk of andesite stone that measures a great 9 feet in height and 12.5 feet in width. The gate opening in its center measured 4.6 feet wide. Above the opening, the most noteworthy feature of this ancient structure had been a relief depiction of a deity. The deity's head appears to have been decorated by a rather interesting headdress, or a ray that emitted from the face in each direction. It can also be seen holding a staff in both of its hands. It's been suggested by historians that the deity may be a depiction of the sun god, while others believe that the face is more representative of tears and reference to the weeping god. Other sources have theorized that the deity is Viracocha, a predecessor of the Inca deity of creation. The cosmogony myth details that Viracocha had emerged from Lake Titicaca when the world had been in absolute darkness. The deity had brought with it light by forming the sun, moon, and stars. Viracocha had then made mankind by breathing life into stones. His first creations had resulted in giants, which were said to not have the capabilities of thought. The deity was so dissatisfied with this creation that he destroyed them to make a better one, and this time he made the use of smaller-sized stones. Situated around the central character are 48 depictions of birds, or human figures, which have been designated as the messengers of God. Despite the various theories, it remains uncertain as to who the central deity and the surrounding figures may be a depiction of. Due to its mysterious nature, the Gate of the Sun has been subject to various theories, some of which are as far-fetched as they come. One theory suggests that this monolith is actually some sort of portal to another dimension. Looking at this theory from a religious perspective, it might be believed that this was a portal to the world of the gods. A more widely accepted theory was that the gateway is an agricultural calendar, which is why an alternative name is associated with it, the Calendar Gate. There's another suggestion that states that the creation is in fact a calendar gate, but one that reflects a solar year that's different from the one that we know today. It appears that it's 290 days in length, consisting of 12 months made up of 24 days each, with an additional 2 days. There's another aspect concerning the Gate of the Sun, which is also a topic of debate. This concerns the creation's age, where some researchers have suggested that it was built 14,000 years ago. A curious find on the monolith may suggest that it's far younger than this, though. Evidence of a small number of depictions on its surface are thought to be unfinished. The Tiwanaku culture began to decline sometime around the 11th century, and at the start of the 12th century it was lost entirely. While some of the ruins in this city may have dated back to 14,000 years ago, recent methods have found that they were founded between 300 BC and 110 AD. The mysteries surrounding the entirety of Tiwanaku have allowed access to pseudo-archaeologists, along with their various claims, and the claims of the general conspiracy theorists who state that the monoliths had been made by giants or aliens. The site on which the Gate of the Sun stands was first documented by Pedro Cieza de Leon in 1549, prior to the rediscovery by Europeans. When it had been rediscovered, the creation was found with a decent crack and lying on its side. It was thought that this was perhaps due to a lightning strike, but this can't be verified. The mythology surrounding the Gate of the Sun suggests that it had been giants that threw it to the ground, resulting in its damage. The truth surrounding what the structure may be remains a mystery and a subject of debate. Some believe that it's been decorated with astronomical connotations of possible angel-like beings. It's believed that there should have been a door in place, but the builders never got around to finishing it. The mysterious monolith itself makes for a beautiful and intriguing sight when the sun passes through it. Like the many other monolithic structures, this creation may have also had something to do with solstices and equinoxes, but this is something that we may never know for sure. In 1885, Tsar Alexander III of Russia gave his wife, Empress Maria Feodorovna, an ornamental egg designed by one of the best jewelers in the empire. It started a tradition that would last until the fall of the monarchy decades later. But today, the Faberge eggs remain symbols of the extravagant displays of wealth and loyalty displayed by royalty. They've become collector's items, and none are more highly sought after than the 6 or 7 missing eggs. By the late 19th century, Russia was on the edge of revolution. Much of Western Europe saw the country as being behind, with serfdom only abolished in 1861. But that hadn't made much of an improvement to the lives of the millions of impoverished people across the nation. Anarchist movements were growing in strength, with one taking the life of Tsar Alexander II, who was actually the ruler who was moving towards more liberal ideas. His son, Alexander III, took the country hard towards autocracy, with himself at the center of the nation. Things became even harder for the lives of average people. There were crackdowns against non-Russians, a severe famine, and a cholera epidemic. Unsurprisingly, more violent movements against the crown continued, as well as other riots. Attempts were made on Alexander's life as people demanded change. Despite the social and political upheaval going on around them, the royal family continued to live their lives of luxury. According to many sources, it was to distract his wife from the more disturbing events that Alexander commissioned the first Faberge egg. The House of Faberge was a jewelry firm founded by Gustave Faberge in 1842. It was known for its expert craftsmanship creating jewelry, silverware, clocks, and clockwork models. Getting a gift from this company didn't just mean buying something that looked nice, but something that would be impressive in other ways. The company was hired to make an Easter gift for the Tsarina. It was supposed to be a one-off and was designed according to instructions given by Alexander. It was a white enamel egg, just 2.5 inches high and 1.5 inches wide. A gold band was around the middle of the egg, splitting the egg in two. When the two sides were twisted, the enamel layer came apart to reveal a golden yolk. This could also be opened to reveal a golden hen. The tail feathers of this hen hid a miniature replica of the imperial crown. Faberge wanted to include a diamond ring, but the Tsar insisted on a ruby pendant. The egg is relatively simple, especially when compared to those that would come after it, but delighted the Empress and inspired Alexander to order more from the company. From that point on, every year a new egg would be delivered to the royal couple. The only instructions were that they were to be unique, and each one was to contain a surprise of some kind. After Tsar Nicholas II took the throne, he continued the tradition of ordering 2 eggs each year, one for his wife and one for his mother. In total, 52 eggs would be created, though the last 2 never actually made it to the royal family. Each ranged in size and style, with some up to 14 inches tall. All but one had a surprise, which included a model of a carriage of clocks and portraits of the royal family. Life only became harder for the general population of Russia, especially after the country joined World War I in 1914. Even when this was happening, the traditional Faberge egg gifts continued. With materials limited during the war, some of the later eggs were less extravagant than earlier ones, but still excessive considering everything else that was going on. The final 2 eggs, created in 1917, would never reach their intended recipients. The last, designed for Tsarina Alexandra, wasn't finished. The revolution had finally taken place, and the Tsar had been abdicated. Faberge tried to send the penultimate egg to Nicholas's brother, but the Duke fled before it arrived. The treasures of the royal family were taken in by the Bolshevik government after the revolutions. There was little use for diamond and pearl-covered eggs, and like other treasures, they were sold as part of the Treasure for Tractors scheme. At the time, the eggs didn't get much attention. Most weren't intrinsically valuable, and it's easy to imagine that buyers in a war-torn Europe or in the United States weren't as interested in these as they were in paintings by known artists. But in the decades that followed, interest in the eggs grew. They came to symbolize romance and love, as well as representing extreme wealth and fine art. The later eggs were considered the last great commissions of objets d'art. The fact that there were only 52 of them also made them extremely rare. There were some other Faberge eggs made for other buyers, but those made for Tsar Alexander and Nicholas, the Imperial eggs, were highly sought after. Tracing the majority of the eggs was relatively simple. The provisional government kept a record of all the treasures that were confiscated in 1922, and it was possible to trace various items from one sale to another. Even though the majority ended up in the hands of private collectors, it was usually possible to find out which private collector. Others were much harder. Often there wasn't a particularly detailed description of the eggs. The 1922 inventory or records, kept by Faberge, would be the best description available, and there was rarely any picture. It was possible to mix up different eggs. For example, for a long time, the blue serpent egg, currently held by the Prince of Monaco, was believed to be the 3rd imperial egg, despite not matching descriptions. The task of tracking down the Faberges was made even harder by the fact that it often wasn't one piece that was being looked for. Almost every egg had a surprise which could also go missing. But eventually the location of each egg was identified. That is, with the exception of 6 or possibly 7, whose locations remain a mystery to historians. The first missing Faberge egg is the hen with the sapphire pendant. It was the second egg ever created, given in 1886. To add to the mystery of this, there isn't even a photograph of the item, and descriptions vary. What we do know about it is that there was a golden hen decorated with diamonds, which was poking up a sapphire egg from a nest. This egg could be worn as a pendant. It was recorded during the 1922 inventory, but what happened to it after this point remains a mystery. The next mysterious egg was the cherub with chariot, the 4th egg to be created. The egg itself was golden, as well as the chariot that it sat on and the cherub that pulled it. Inside was a clock, a relatively common surprise for the collection. The egg is featured in a photo of a collection of Faberges taken in 1902. Unfortunately, it was hidden behind another and can only be seen in the blurry reflection of the glass behind it. Like the earlier egg, it was recorded in the 1922 inventory, but after that, its history remains a mystery. It's possible it was sold to Armand Hammer, who purchased a number of Faberge eggs. But if he owned it, he didn't seem to know the significance of this item in particular, and appears to have sold it, and where it remains today is a mystery. The 5th Faberge is also missing. This one was named Nécessaire, and there's a more detailed photograph of it. Unfortunately, we don't have many details of what it looked like, but it had multicolored stones and included 13 diamond-encrusted implements inside. This was sold to a British antique company named Wartsky, which sold it in 1952 to an unidentified individual listed on the ledger as a stranger. Since then, it hasn't appeared in any auction catalog and may be held by someone who doesn't realize the significance of the item they bought. Not all of the missing eggs disappeared after the Revolution. 3 didn't seem to make it into the 1922 inventory, indicating they went missing beforehand. These were mauve, which we have very little information about, and no photographs. The Royal Danish, and the Alexander III commemorative egg. Each were given by Nicholas II to his mother. The Royal Danish was described as being made from blue and white enamel, with a statue of an elephant on top. It was one of the largest eggs at 9 inches tall. Its last known location was Gatchina Palace in 1917, when it featured on a list of treasures compiled by Imperial loyalists. It's believed that it was then evacuated to safety, along with other treasures listed. If so, it wasn't the only Faberge egg to be saved in this way, but it is the only one that hasn't been located since. The Alexander III commemorative egg was another that wasn't featured in any inventories and apparently went missing before the Revolution. It was made from platinum, white, and gold enamel and featured a bust of Alexander III. There's a photograph of this egg, but no details about its last known location or what might have happened to it. There is a 7th possibly missing egg. This is the Empire Nephrite, which has differing descriptions in different accounts. An egg believed to be the nephrite is currently a part of a private New York collection, but historians are still debating whether this is the actual Imperial Faberge or another treasure. Given the name and the mystique surrounding these items, historians hope they might one day come to light. It could be that the people who hold them don't realize their significance. They may have been handed down through family, and it would only take one curious recipient to identify a lost treasure. But unfortunately, that might not be the case. In 2012, a scrap dealer came forward with the 3rd Imperial, which had been lost up until that point. He'd had it for decades after buying it for a few $1,000s at a flea market. He'd been planning to sell it for scrap, but couldn't get a good return on his investment. Thankfully, he decided to do some research before melting it down. But in another timeline, he could have simply melted it down and sold it on, never realizing its significance. It's possible that this occurred with one or more of the missing eggs, meaning their fates will remain a mystery. Some of the biggest historical mysteries concern the final fates of ships that have disappeared over the centuries. For decades, the location of the infamous Titanic was the biggest mystery. and it wouldn't be solved until 1985. It wasn't until the wreck was discovered that some of the details of the sinking were actually confirmed, despite survivors having given their accounts of events decades earlier. Every year, it seems more ships are uncovered as we further explore the depths of our oceans. But there are still some that remain unsolved. Before the Titanic, there was the President, and its final voyage remains a mystery over 100 years later. There were a lot of similarities between the Titanic and the President, which was launched in 1840. The SS President was owned by the British and American Steam Navigation Company and was the second purpose-built transatlantic steamship the company owned. The company had been founded 2 years before the President's disappearance by American lawyer Junius Smith, who had family on both sides of the Atlantic. He spent a lot of time sailing between the US and United Kingdom, a round trip that would take an average of 55 days. He knew it was possible to do this quicker, and steam paddle boats were the answer. At the same time, engineers at Great Western had the same idea. There was a race to see who could put the idea in motion first. The British and American company's first purpose-built ship, the British Queen, was delayed, so they used the ship designed for shorter distances, the Sirius. This was the first steam passenger ship to travel from England to New York, beating the Great Western by a day, even though it was considerably smaller. It was a positive start to the company, and when the British Queen was launched in 1839, it did start to earn money. This was the fastest way to travel across the ocean. In an age when the telegraph was in its infancy, the steamships could be used to send letters as well as people across the ocean. Almost as soon as the British Queen was launched, work began on a second ship. The goal of the SS President was to make passengers feel like they were in a luxurious 5-star hotel, not sailing across the ocean. This was one of the similarities it would have with the later Titanic. Today, we think of the Titanic as being advertised as unsinkable, but really it was its luxury that attracted attention, as well as its size. The SS President was also the largest steamship ever made at that point. It was thought that the larger the ship, the faster it would go. But that would only work if the engines that powered it increased along with the ship, and this didn't happen. Even worse for the President, it was an entirely newly designed ship. It was the same as the British Queen, but with a third deck on top. Because the design hadn't been made with 3 decks in mind, the hull of the ship wasn't right. The ship was top-heavy and needed to have extra cargo on board to stop it from rolling over easily. Even with these problems in place, the British and American companies were optimistic when they launched the President. Unlike the Titanic, where speed wasn't so much of a factor, making the journey as quickly as possible was still the aim for the President. Its parent company was still battling with Great Western to do the journey as quickly as possible. The British Queen could reach the same speed as the Great Western when going westward, but was half a knot slower during the return journey. But on average, the Great Western was almost a day quicker going to the US and 3 days quicker on the return journey. The goal for the SS President was to beat that record. The first trip didn't accomplish that. Going westward, it actually managed to match the Great Western's average of 16.5 days, but that wasn't good enough for the company. It was also overtaken by a ship from Cunard, adding to the embarrassment. The captain was fired, and a new one was put in charge for the second voyage. This second voyage went even worse, as the captain was forced to turn around after leaving New York to come get more coal. As there was no way for news to travel faster than the ship, this left people in England panicking when it didn't show up as scheduled. There was no way to know what had happened to it, and people feared the worst. The President did eventually show up a few weeks later. Unsurprisingly, this captain was also fired. The British and American Steam Navigation Company now appointed Lieutenant Richard Roberts to captain the ship. Roberts had been the captain of the Sirius when it had beaten the Great Western across the Atlantic. That ship had run out of fuel to keep the boilers working and the steam at the right pressure during the journey, so the men had been forced to burn furniture. According to stories, Roberts had to threaten them to get the crew to do so, but it had worked. Since then, he'd been the captain of the British Queen, which had been relatively successful. He knew that it wasn't the captains of the President that were making it fail. The engine simply wasn't large enough for the ship, and it wasn't designed properly. He described the president as a coffin ship and tried to convince management to let him stay on the British Queen, and he eventually relented though. Matters aboard the president were made worse when the paddles had to be changed. The paddles had initially been feathered, which was the fastest design, but this was under patent and the British and American companies didn't have permission to use it. They had to change to a non-feathered design, further slowing their ship. The president's third and final voyage left Liverpool on February 10, 1841. The trip took 21 days, and there didn't seem to be any problems. The ship spent 8 days in New York, loading up with cargo, fuel, and passengers before setting off on March 11th for the return journey. There were 30 passengers total, as well as 106 crew members. The passengers would have enjoyed spacious cabins, a gallery with 10 oil paintings depicting Christopher Columbus, and a large dining room. The ship was designed for well over 100 passengers, so they would have a lot of room. It was around April 3rd when people in Liverpool began to worry about the SS President. News reports at the time noted that the ship had a history of making people anxious and tried to assure the public that it would show up eventually. As time went on, more and more theories about the ship were published. One theory suggested that it had turned south to Bermuda for fuel and would be delayed, as had been the case during its second trip. Later, there was a story that the British Queen had been damaged on drift ice, and a theory suggested that the president had also had trouble with ice. This theory was dismissed, as there wouldn't have been ice this far south when the president was sailing. It was hoped that there'd simply been a detour and it would show up any day. For months, local newspapers reported on the search for the vessel. At first, they tried to remain optimistic. There were reports off the east coast of the US that the president would have been caught in. It was feared that water might have come overboard and extinguished the boiler, which would have left it stranded and helpless. But previous captains tried to assure the public that this didn't happen. They believed that whatever had happened to the president, it would still be above water and would eventually be found. But as more and more time passed, hope faded. The last known sighting of the president was by sailors aboard the ship, the Orpheus, which was sailing about 2 hours behind. The captain said that the ship had been within the sight of Orpheus until sunset on March 12th. They were both in a heavy storm, and the president seemed to be unstable. The following day, the wind direction had quickly changed, making the sea even more chaotic. The Orpheus didn't see the president again or notice any wreckage of the ship. For a long time, it was assumed that the ship must have gone down in this storm, but another theory was put forward in June of 1942. In May of that year, a Spanish ship named Havana, sailing to Europe, came across a badly damaged and burned ship. Parts of the ship were missing, but they couldn't tell if it had once been of considerable length. There was nothing in the wreckage to identify it and no signs of any personal items, but the large timbers and iron clamps left them certain that this was a large steamer. It was located much further south than the president had been seen, though. It was also located a year after the ship had gone missing. It was possible that it had been somewhere else during that time, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. In September of 1941, there were reports that a message in a bottle had been found. It claimed to have been sent by a passenger from the president and described them being stranded on an iceberg after the ship had sunk. Another letter in a bottle said that the president was sinking fast and gave no further details. Both of these were considered a hoax. The SS President was the first passenger steamship to go missing in the Atlantic. She was also the last ship owned by the British and American companies. It had been underinsured, and the company went bankrupt less than a year after she disappeared. The ship has never been found, and the exact reason for her disappearance remains a mystery. It's likely that the theory that she capsized in a storm is correct, but that doesn't explain why no debris was ever located. The Polynesian exploration and expansion across the Pacific Ocean is one of the greatest accomplishments in human history. But many of the details surrounding the exploration continue to puzzle historians and remain a mystery to this day. These questions surround aspects like why things such as the Great Pause happened, what inspired the Polynesians to spread across the ocean, and the time frames that they had. But one of the most puzzling aspects of this exploration surrounds the mystery of a staple food found across the Polynesian islands, the sweet potato. During the European exploration of the New World, countless food items were brought back and became integrated into European cuisine. The tomato and potato are two of the most widespread, but they weren't alone. Plants from chilies to sunflowers and maize to peanuts were introduced from the Americas to the rest of the world. One of these plants was the sweet potato, native to Colombia and other tropical regions of the Americas. The sweet potato had been cultivated by South Americans for over 1,000 years before Spanish explorers arrived. Some findings have suggested that the sweet potato was actually cultivated around 8,000 years ago. What is certain is that it was a staple crop for those living in and near the Incan Empire. Like the white potato, it was valued due to its high caloric content and the ability to grow in relatively poor soil conditions. Different groups of native people had different names. The Quechua was the name for the Kumla or Kumar, and most of the native names were similar to this. The sweet potato was brought back to Europe and spread through various recipes. It was a few hundred years before European explorers reached the Pacific Ocean and the islands that Polynesians had been inhabiting for hundreds of years. As far as they knew, there'd been no contact between these people and those from South America. The South Americans hadn't told them any stories of these far-off specks of land with their own unique culture. In fact, the European explorers were surprised to find anything there at all, which wasn't the old world islands that they'd traveled to previously. So it wasn't especially surprising when they discovered that the sweet potato was a popular crop across not only some, but all of the Pacific islands they came across. From Hawaii to New Zealand, the sweet potato was a common crop, and appeared to have been since before the Europeans even discovered the Americas. For a long time, this has puzzled historians and left a mystery in our understanding of how the world was connected until relatively recently. There are a few possible answers to this strange mystery. The first is that of natural dispersal. None of the islands of the Pacific Ocean were once part of the continents. That meant that all the plants that lived there had to have arrived on once barren rocks. This is commonly done through two methods: birds or the wind and sea. Birds are responsible for bringing seeds from plants around the Pacific to these islands. They're also usually the first animal species to settle on new islands. Some plants even adapted to be more likely to germinate if they'd gone through the digestive system of a bird. Seeds can also get a ride in the feathers of birds. It's possible that they could have lasted hundreds of miles in the air and open water before a bird arrived at land to nest. Researchers believe that birds helped sweet potatoes to spread around South America, but whether this would have enabled the spread to far-off Pacific islands is a different matter. The seeds would have to last in the digestive tract or the feathers for a considerable amount of time. While it might be possible that the seeds reached islands near the American continent, more far-off islands seemed impossible. Other plants are known to have spread to distant islands by floating on the wind or in the water. The coconut is the most famous example of this. The coconut is buoyant and able to float on the water for weeks. Its tough exterior and high water content help the seed stay alive in the salty ocean, and the plant has adapted to being able to grow in the soft sand of whatever beach it may come across. But most plants aren't adapted in the same way the coconut is. Being in ocean water for an extended period of time can destroy life inside of the seed. Even those plants that might survive the journey might not be able to grow in the sandy soil that they eventually land on. Based only on ocean currents, it would have taken the sweet potato 120 days to make landfall in the Society Islands, the first land it would have reached by this method. Even the coconut would have trouble spending that much time at sea, and the sweet potato doesn't seem to have as many adaptations to making the journey as the coconut does. On top of that, the sweet potato doesn't grow in soils that are too wet, like those that it would find when it eventually landed. Scientists haven't been able to definitively rule out that this wasn't what happened, but it also hasn't been proven that this would have been possible. The other answers to this strange mystery are human. If the sweet potato was spread through natural means, that makes the naming of it across cultures one of the strangest coincidences. Across Polynesia, there are a few different names for this staple crop, but they all appear to have the same root word. In New Zealand, the Maori call it kumera. In the Marquesas Islands of French Polynesia, it's kumaa. In Samoa, it's umala, and in Hawaii, it's uala. All of these seem to have been derived from the same Quechua name, Kumla, or something similar. It may be possible for a bird to have brought a sweet potato seed across the ocean, but it definitely didn't bring the name. This seems to be proof that there was contact between the Polynesians and native South Americans long before Columbus arrived. If there was contact, no stories of this survived. The Polynesians recorded history only through oral stories, and the Incans didn't have a writing system in the traditional sense. They could record information through knots on strings, but this doesn't seem to have been used to tell narratives of any kind. So it's not surprising that there's no written accounts of this contact happening, but it's more surprising that there are no oral accounts. There are no stories of people who came from the sea in ships and spoke a different language, like you would expect if something like that had happened in the past. In Polynesia, there's no great story about how they came to the sweet potato. Only the Maori have a myth surrounding the sweet potato, which involves it either being stolen from a god or given by a chief, who then punishes the recipient because they didn't take care of a bird that the chief lent them. Beyond obtaining the sweet potato, it seems strange that the Polynesians wouldn't tell stories of an enormous landmass they came across in the direction that the sun came from. This would undoubtedly have spawned legends. But despite the lack of stories about the contact, it does seem to be the most plausible. The Polynesians definitely had the skill and resources capable of making such a journey, especially considering they managed to get to Easter Island, which isn't that far off the coast of South America. There's even a little archaeological evidence that this might have happened. Researchers have found chicken bones in South America that appear to date to the early 1400s, just before the Europeans arrived. The evidence for sweet potato in Polynesia is much older than this, but it's possible that evidence for earlier trades between the two people in South America simply hasn't been found yet. It's possible this mystery may be solved as further research is done into the histories of these various islands and cultures. But for now, it remains an intriguing aspect of the history of ocean exploration. Throughout history, there have been countless mysterious disappearances that have gone unsolved. The vast majority of those are eventually forgotten. The individual's disappearance would have been distressing to their family members and may have been a story told to the next generation of those family members. But after a period of time, the story isn't told again and is eventually forgotten. But there are some individuals who made such a mark on history that their disappearance is remembered over 100 years later. It might be a surprise to learn that one of the founding fathers of the United States disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a historical mystery that may never be resolved. John Lansing Jr. was a lawyer by trade who became involved with politics during the American Revolution. He was the descendant of Dutch settlers and was born in Albany, New York in 1754. After training as a lawyer, he served as a military secretary to General Philip Schuyler. He would later serve in New York State Assembly as a member of the Congress of the Confederation. During meetings, he took meticulous notes, which would provide valuable insight into politics during the founding of the United States. Lansing was one of 3 delegates sent by New York to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The original goal of the convention was to address problems with the Articles of Confederation, but the outcome of the event was to be an entirely new constitution, and one which bound the states into a single country. Lansing was unhappy with this, as he believed that they only had the authority to make amendments to existing Articles of Confederation. He would withdraw from the convention before it was completed, but his influence before this was considered important. After this, Lansing focused on state politics and served as a judge for many years before hitting the mandated retirement age of 60. He continued to work in business after this point, and still appeared to be in good health when he vanished without a trace at the age of 75 in 1829. Nearly 200 years later, historians still aren't certain about what happened. There are a few details that we know for certain. Lansing was in New York City at the time of his disappearance. He was still living in Albany, but had traveled to New York City for business. He checked into the City Hotel in Manhattan on the morning of December 12th. This was one of the most luxurious hotels in the area. Located on Broadway, it took up an entire block and had 100 parlors. It was a favorite of Lansing's in-laws, the wealthy Ray family. That evening, he had dinner at the hotel with his brother-in-law, banker and socialite Robert Ray. What they discussed is unknown, but Lansing did promise to visit Robert at his home on Marketfield Street later that evening. After dinner, Lansing went to his door. He left the hotel just before 5 p.m. and was last seen by a hotel porter who brushed his coat before he left. He was dressed in black, had powdered his hair, and was carrying a small carpet bag. He left his trunk and cane. All sources agreed that he was going on a steamship to post a letter to Albany. Some say that it was an important letter, but as with many details in this mystery, what it was about has never been revealed. Lansing never made it back to his hotel room and would never be seen again. Lansing's disappearance was quickly noticed by his friends and family. The disappearance of such a prominent person made headlines in New York and other parts of the US. His family offered a $100 reward for information leading to Lansing being found, but nobody came forward with anything. Theories would also be put forward relatively quickly. Before the end of the month, one popular theory appeared in newspapers. It was a stormy night when Lansing went missing. It was theorized that due to the weather and the fact that it had already been dark at that time, Lansing had fallen into the Hudson River. It was known that he was heading towards the water, and it's possible that he lost his way a little and accidentally fell in from the bank. Alternatively, he could have fallen off the gangplank onto the ship. The weather conditions would have made it difficult for anybody to hear the sound of someone entering the water, or any calls for help Lansing might have made. This was the most obvious explanation, and in the spring of 1830, it looked as if the story might be proven true. The body of an elderly man washed ashore not far from where Lansing went missing. The initial description matched Lansing, but the clothing wasn't correct, and it was determined to be another individual. Lansing was still missing. This didn't mean he hadn't entered the water, but there was no proof that he did. It's not known whether or not Lansing actually made it to the ship to deliver his letter. That means that he could have gone missing at any point between the hotel and the ship, or the ship and Marketfield Street. On his way to the water, he would have passed second-class boarding houses. The trip from there to Marketfield would have taken him past an area called Castle Garden, where many homeless people camped out. According to writers at the time, the crime rate in this area was high, and Robert Ray was later forced to give up his mansion there because he couldn't deal with it. The fact that he likely passed through less savory areas inspired new theories. It was possible that Lansing might have met with foul play. He could have come across opportunistic attackers who believed he was carrying money. There were rumors that his body had been dumped in the Hudson or sold to surgeons, both not entirely implausible suggestions. In 1869, a new theory was put forward. This came from newspaper mogul Thurlow Weed. Weed liked to think of himself as a kingmaker in New York politics. He portrayed himself as being omnipotent, having gathered knowledge about anybody significant in politics. This often came from letters forwarded to him, usually with the original sender never even knowing. Weed claimed that Lansing had met with foul play and the culprits had targeted him for political reasons. He said that information about the conspiracy had been given to him by a high-standing member of society who was part of the plot. Weed never provided any details that he claimed to know, but said that the individuals involved were all prominent members of the community who had pristine reputations. Weed was sworn to secrecy until after all those involved passed away, but he never revealed any names. He said that the culprits were no longer alive, and making their names public would do nothing but hurt the innocent family members they'd left behind. Lansing's grandson wrote to Weed asking for the names and any other information to be released, but Weed took that secret to his grave. Whether or not any of this is true is another mystery. If there was some kind of conspiracy to make a prominent New York judge vanish, it was the sort of thing that Weed would want people to think he knew about. It was important to his image as someone who knew everything that happened in New York. Weed was trying to protect that image, and to gather more information for himself at the time when his claim was made public. He claimed to have evidence that the conspiracy was real, but this has also never been revealed. A year after this story came to light, a different newspaper was given another explanation for the mystery. An anonymous individual, identified only as a respected older gentleman who'd been a friend of the Lansing family, claimed that the family knew exactly what had happened to their missing loved one. At the time, Lansing was having financial problems. He had speculated on land and lost a fortune during the Panic of 1819, A few months before his disappearance, there were notices in the newspaper about Lansing's land being confiscated by the sheriff. According to this older gentleman, Lansing took matters into his own hands. His life ended in his hotel room on the date of his supposed disappearance. His family then secretly placed his body in the family vault and claimed he had disappeared. The newspaper then retracted the story not long after. Interest in Lansing's disappearance faded over time. The theory that he fell into the Hudson was the generally accepted theory. It's a possible solution to countless unsolved disappearances, and is the most likely solution here. But there was never any evidence for any of the potential theories, and the case remains a strange historical mystery. It can often seem like there isn't much left to discover about the ancient world. There are plenty of aspects of ancient Egypt or ancient Rome that archaeologists are still trying to uncover. But the general landscape of the various eras seems relatively well known. But it wasn't too long ago that archaeologists discovered an entire long-lost ancient kingdom that even the likes of Herodotus was unaware of. The kingdom is known today as Urartu, the name given to it by the Assyrian Empire. Ararat was the name used for it in the Old Testament, though it received only minor mentions. Today it's referred to as the Kingdom of Van. But most historians believe that the people referred to themselves as Biaini and their kingdom as Biaini Li. Today, we know little about the kingdom, but there are still many unanswered questions and historical mysteries that researchers are trying to solve. To begin at the end, Urartu disappeared from maps around the middle of the 6th century BC. It was so destroyed that the neighboring Greeks wouldn't even have stories of the kingdom. The Armenian people replaced the kingdom, which had been located in what is today the Armenian highlands, stretching into northern Iran. Some old monuments of the Urartu people survived, but there was no information about who created them. Medieval Armenians constructed a legend about these old monuments, attributing them to King Ara the Beautiful and Queen Semiramis. It was an interesting story, but not one that gathered much attention. That was until the 1820s, when a French scholar decided that they should find out if there was any truth behind the legend. A German archaeologist was sent to investigate. He found inscriptions in an unknown language which he copied, but political turmoil in the area meant he and his guides didn't make it back to France alive. His notes would make it back in the 1840s, but there was no way to decipher the language at the time. As scholars tried to piece together this ancient language, which was written in a then undeciphered cuneiform, looting took place at the archaeological sites. As there was no knowledge of an ancient kingdom in the area, artifacts were attributed to the neighboring Assyrian Empire, which ruled at the same time that Urartu existed. Anybody who knew much about the Assyrians would have noticed that the intricate bronze statues didn't fit the style and seemed to depict gods that Assyrians elsewhere didn't worship. But the artifacts were still sold to museums across Europe with the incorrect information. Eventually, scholars and archaeologists managed to piece together enough of the puzzle to figure out that this was an entirely separate kingdom. How the Urartu kingdom came to be is a mystery. It's believed that the area started out with many different smaller kingdoms that existed in the area from the 14th century BC. Despite the highland location, the kingdom had plenty of resources, including tin, which would have been a valuable commodity during the Bronze Age. But the larger united Urartu kingdom didn't arise until sometime in the 9th century, after the Iron Age began. Historians have speculated that a more united kingdom developed to hold off invasions from Assyria, which was located to the south. There is evidence that the people adopted a lot from Assyria, including their helmets and cuneiform writing, but they had their own unique language. The only known relative to this language is Hurrian, which is completely unconnected to any Indo-European or Semitic language. This would have made it incredibly difficult to decipher, and it remained a mystery until after the Second World War, when the Calassian stele was uncovered. This was the same inscription that the German archaeologists described in the 1820s, but it wasn't until scholars found the actual inscription that they were able to unravel the language. This was like a Rosetta Stone for the Urartian language, with the dual inscription in Urartian and Assyrian, which had since been deciphered. The inscription was about the conquest of a city, but the language was much more valuable to researchers. Lots of other inscriptions in Urartian have been found, but it was now possible to solve some of the mysteries of the history of this ancient kingdom. Like other kings in the area, the kings of Urartu wrote inscriptions of their achievements. These included taking over neighboring cities, fights against the Assyrians and other neighbors, and the building of waterways. Canal construction was an important aspect of the public works for the people in this area, and they were often highlighted as much as military campaigns. Despite their inscriptions, a lot of what we know about Urartu comes from the Assyrians, who did write a fair bit about their northern neighbor. Of course, they were also typically enemies of the Urartians, which meant that things might be exaggerated, but most did seem to fit with the historical record. There were many battles between the Assyrians and the Urartu people, but what finally caused their downfall is another mystery. The Urartu kingdom completely disappeared at some time in the 6th century. There was some decline over a few generations, but the people were still building monuments to their main god, Haldi, even shortly before the kingdom's demise. In the late 7th century, the Assyrians came under attack from the Medes and the Scythians, a nomadic group that migrated from Central Asia. The two groups were able to take over Assyria, and the Medes became the dominant force in the area. It's believed that something similar might have happened to Urartu. One archaeological site featured arrowheads typically used by Scythians, but Urartu seemed to have outlasted the Assyrians and may have eventually been destroyed by Cyrus the Great. A lot of the destruction seems to have been done by fire, as burned buildings have been located. Whatever happened, it happened quickly. Granaries were found filled and abandoned, and weapons and precious belongings were left behind. What happened after this is even more mysterious. The people of Urartu could have been entirely wiped out and replaced by the Armenians. There doesn't appear to be any connection between the Urartian language and the later Armenian languages, but it's also possible that the Urartians became integrated with the later Armenians. There's still a lot about this culture and kingdom that we're still piecing together. Archaeologists have been able to uncover the names of all the kings, but many of the later kings left behind no inscriptions about their achievements or what happened during their rule. There's also some mystery surrounding the gods that they worshipped. We have names, and in some cases what they were meant to represent, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. For example, we know that Haldi was the head of the gods, but what his role was is something of a mystery. We know that the people made grand monuments, many of which were described by the Assyrians, but not many have survived. Fortresses were also important. The name Urartu actually comes from the Assyrian word for Arashtu, meaning high place, which either refers to the general mountainous region or the practice of fortifications built on rock promontories. Most of these were destroyed, but one may have recently been discovered in Lake Van. In 2017, underwater archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a fortress in the lake, which is the largest lake in Turkey. It's not known for certain if this was the ancient civilization or something more modern. It would have been built when the water level was much lower, indicating that it was a long time ago, and seems to match up with what we know about Urartu. But it may have been constructed during the Middle Ages, the same time when the legends surrounding other Urartu ruins were spread. One of the most interesting aspects of this mystery is that it's still being unraveled today. With many other mysteries from ancient times, the hope of it actually being solved is relatively small. It's unlikely we'll ever find out what the purpose of certain objects was, or who created them. But as this mystery has only recently been uncovered, work to put more pieces of the puzzle together is still being done. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.